Previously in part 1 of Don't You Dare Die on Me, a battlefield surgeon named Valentina Delgado has been operating for 12 hours on her closest friend combat medic, Declan O'Brien, whose abdomen was torn open by shrapnel in a city under siege. By the 6th hour, she knew he would die. She did not stop. Outside her tent, casualties mounted. She was the only surgeon. 4 people died waiting for hands that were busy holding a man those hands could not save. At the 9th hour, O'Brien woke without anesthesia, looked at her across his own open body and said, "Don't make me the price." She did not listen. She sutured dead tissue. She sutured it again. Part 1 ended at the 12th hour with Delgado's hands still inside him and a piece of paper on the instrument tray bearing 4 names she would carry for the rest of her life. This is part 2. This is the hour the helicopter comes. The hour the city empties. The hour a dying man asks the woman saving him to do the one thing she has spent 24 years refusing to do. This is the hour she opens her hands. Captain Park entered the tent at the 16th hour, and Delgado knew why he was there before he spoke. The morphine ran out at the 7th hour, and the ketamine ran out at the 8th, and by the 9th hour, Declan O'Brien was conscious inside his own open body, with nothing between him and the truth but the thin and failing membrane of shock, which is the body's last analgesic, the drug it manufactures from its own terror when all other drugs are gone. Delgado felt him wake the way she felt everything now through her hands. A change in the tension of the abdominal wall. A contraction of the rectus muscles, involuntary, the body's ancient reflex to protect the cavity, to close what has been opened, and it was futile because what had been opened could not be closed by muscle. Alone could only be closed by her hands, and her hands were inside him when his muscles tried to push them out. And she said without looking at his face, without looking anywhere but at the wound, "Don't move." And she said it in the voice she used for patients who were waking during procedures. The voice that was calm and authoritative and absolutely without emotion, the voice that said, "I am in control," even when she was not, especially when she was not, because the voice was the last instrument she possessed that still functioned as designed. He moved anyway. His right hand came up from the table, slowly trembling, the fingers half curled, and it traveled through the air between them with the terrible deliberateness of a hand that knows exactly where it is going, and it found her forearm. His fingers closed around her wrist, not hard, not desperate. The grip of a man who has reached for something in the dark and found it and is holding it, not because he is drowning, but because he wants to know that it is there. She looked at his face. His eyes were open. They were looking at her. They were the same eyes she had seen across operating tables and across ammunition crates and across the hoods of Humvees in the gray light of 100 mornings. And they were not the same eyes at all, because behind them was a knowledge that had not been there before, a knowledge that the body acquires only when it has crossed a certain threshold, when it has entered the territory from which some bodies return and most do not. And the knowledge was not fear. It was clarity. The terrible, useless clarity of a man who can see the bottom of his own wound. "Hey, Doc," he said. His voice was a ruin. Dry cracked, stripped of every quality that had made it his. The warmth, the Irish lilt he performed for nurses. The laugh that sounded like furniture being moved in another room. All of it gone, replaced by a sound that was barely voice at all, that was air moving through vocal cords that had been screaming, or not screaming, for 9 hours, that had been silent while his body did the screaming for him. And now the silence was over, and what emerged from it was this, a whisper made of sand. "Don't talk," Delgado said. Her hands did not stop. She was suturing a mesenteric branch that she had already sutured twice, and that had already failed twice, and that would fail again. She knew it would fail again, but her hands did not know this, or did not care. And they continued because continuing was what they did, the way a heart continues, the way breathing continues, not because of will, but because of pattern, because of the deep and mechanical repetition that sustains a body long after the person inside it has stopped giving orders. O'Brien did not stop talking. "Bad, huh?" he said. And the words were not a question. They were a diagnosis. He was a combat medic, and he had spent 3 tours dragging bodies out of rubble and off of roads and through the particular geometry of destruction that urban warfare creates, and he had seen enough open abdomens to know what his felt like from the inside, to read his own wound the way Delgado read it, by sensation, by the quality of the pain, by the specific and terrible literacy that medical training gives you, the literacy that allows you to narrate your own dying in clinical terms while it is happening. Delgado did not answer. She sutured. The vessel held for 4 seconds. Failed. She resutured. Held for 3. The intervals collapsing like the distance between breaths in a body that is forgetting how to breathe. O'Brien's hand was still on her wrist. She could feel his pulse through his fingertips. Or was it her pulse transmitted through her skin into his fingers, and back again, a circuit, a closed loop of 2 hearts beating at different rates through the same point of contact, and she could not tell whose was whose, and this confusion felt like the most intimate thing that had ever happened to her, more intimate than touch, more intimate than language. The commingling of 2 circulatory systems through the thin membrane of skin, the body's boundary. The boundary she had spent her career crossing with scalpels. And now he was crossing with his hand. He talked, was warm, and the sand was the kind that was warm, and the sand was the kind that sticks to wet skin and does not come off, no matter how many times you brush it. And she thought, sand in a wound, grit in a wound, foreign material. In a wound is contamination, is the beginning of infection. And she could not stop translating his words into pathology, because pathology was the only language she still spoke fluently, the only language that kept her hands moving and her mind from following his voice to a beach she had never visited in a world that did not contain operating tables or open abdomens or the sound of artillery repositioning in the streets outside. My brother O'Brien said, "He could swim. Did I ever tell you that, Val? He could swim like it was what he was made for. Like his body was designed for water, the way he paused, and the pause was not hesitation, but pain in the body interrupting the mind to remind it that it was still here, still open, still being sutured by hands that were shaking now, in a rhythm that matched nothing like his body knew water was home." "You told me," Delgado said, and she had not meant to speak, had not authorized her voice to leave her throat, but it left anyway, the way blood leaves a vessel when the wall is compromised, involuntarily, under pressure, because the containment had failed. "You told me about Sean. You told me he was 19. O'Brien's fingers tightened on her wrist. 19, he said. Same age as that kid outside. She felt the sentence enter her body. It passed through the skin of her wrist where his fingers held her, and it traveled up her arm and through her chest, and it found the place where she had put the knowledge of the 19-year-old, and it opened that place the way shrapnel opens a body, without precision, without mercy, tearing through the layers she had built to contain it. She felt her jaw clench. She felt her eyes burn. She felt the salt gather behind her lower lids, the way fluid gathers in the peritoneal cavity, pooling, accumulating, rising toward the surface. She blinked. The salt fell. 2 tears. They dropped from her face into the wound, into O'Brien's open abdomen, into the sterile field that was no longer sterile, that had not been sterile for hours. That was a fiction she maintained, the way she maintained all her fictions, by refusing to look at them directly. She stopped. She reached for the irrigation syringe. She flushed the wound, with saline washing her tears out of his body, washing herself out of him. And the saline was cold, and O'Brien flinched, the full body flinch of a man without anesthesia, feeling liquid on exposed tissue, and she said quietly, almost to herself, "I'm sorry." She did not know what she was apologizing for. The cold saline, the tears, the 19-year-old, the 9 hours, the fact that she was still here, the fact that she would not leave, the fact that apologizing was itself a failure because it meant she had acknowledged a wrong, and acknowledging a wrong meant she knew what she was doing. And knowing what she was doing and doing it anyway was not dedication, was not loyalty, was not love. It was something else. Something she did not have a medical term for. Something that lived in the space between diagnosis and treatment, in the gap between knowing and acting in the wound, between what her hands were doing and what her mind understood. And she could not close this wound because her hands were busy closing his. O'Brien watched her work. He watched with the particular attention of a man who has nothing left to do but watch, whose body has been reduced to a theater and whose consciousness has been reduced to an audience. And he watched her hands the way she imagined he had once watched his brother swim, with admiration, with recognition, with the knowledge that the body he was watching was performing something extraordinary, and that the performance would end. "How long?" he said. 9 hours, she said. She should not have answered. Answering was engagement. Engagement was connection. Connection was the thing that made him a person and not a patient. And she could not afford a person on her table. She needed a patient. She needed anatomy. She needed the Latin and the Greek and the distance they provided. 9 hours, he repeated. And then, with the conversational tone of a man discussing whether, "You know, I'm going to die, right?" She did not answer. He said, "Doc and Val, look at me." She did not look at him. She looked at the mesentery. She looked at the bleeding that would not stop. She looked at the sutures that held for seconds and failed for hours. And she sutured another vessel, and it held, and she waited for it to fail. And it held, and she waited, and it held, and she thought, if I do not look at him, he is a patient. And if he is a patient, I am a surgeon. And if I am a surgeon, I do not stop. "Val," he said, "you're suturing dead tissue. You know that." She knew that. She knew it the way she knew the mesenteric microvasculature was destroyed completely structurally in 3 dimensions. The tissue beneath her sutures had changed color over the last 2 hours, progressing through the spectrum that she had memorized in pathology class and had seen 1,000 times, since pink to pale to gray, to the particular purple that is not bruise, but death, that is the color of tissue, whose blood supply has been interrupted beyond recovery, whose cells have exhausted their oxygen and their glucose and their capacity for anaerobic metabolism. and have begun the slow chemical process of autolysis, of self-digestion of the body, consuming itself one cell at a time. She was suturing into tissue that was digesting itself. She was placing stitches in a body that was eating its own walls. She knew this. "I'm a medic," O'Brien said. "I know what dead tissue looks like. I know what it feels like. And Doc?" He paused, and this time the pause was not pain, but something older than pain, something that preceded pain, the way a diagnosis precedes a symptom, the naming of a thing before the thing arrives. "I can feel it." "Stop talking," Delgado said. Her voice was a wound. She heard it and she did not recognize it, and she thought, whose voice is that? That voice that is thin and sharp and cracked like a suture under tension. That voice that is mine and is not mine. That voice that has been mine for 38 years and is now breaking in a way that voices break when the structure supporting them has been compromised. And she thought of the building next door, the one that had lost its wall, the slow crumble of masonry, the sound of a structure failing. And she understood that the building was her, and the wall was her voice, and the crumble was happening now, in real time, in the space between one word and the next. O'Brien said, "How many people are outside?" She did not answer. Eriksson answered. Eriksson, who had been standing at Delgado's left shoulder for 9 hours, who had handed instruments and held retractors, and counted sponges and not spoken, unless spoken to. Eriksson answered because someone had to, and because Delgado would not, and because Eriksson was 24 years old and still believed that questions deserved answers, that the truth was a thing you owed to people who asked for it. That silence in the presence of a direct question was a form of cruelty. And she said, 14. 5 are red. O'Brien closed his eyes. Delgado watched him close his eyes, and she felt the closure in her own body, felt it as a physical sensation, as though the muscles that controlled her own eyelids had received the same signal as his, as though the nerve impulse had traveled from his brain through his fingers on her wrist and up her arm and into her own motor cortex, and she blinked hard and forced her eyes open, because closing them was agreement, was surrender, was the body's way of saying yes. This is true. This is the thing I did not want to see. And now I have seen it, and I am closing the aperture. And she could not close. She could not afford the dark. 14, O'Brien said, his eyes still shut. 5 red. Yes, he opened his eyes. He looked at Delgado with an expression she had never seen on his face in 3 tours and 914 days. It was not anger. It was not accusation. It was the expression of a man who has been given a gift he did not ask for and cannot return, and the gift is costing other people, and he knows it, and the knowledge is heavier than the shrapnel in his abdomen. "Go," he said. "Go, Doc." Delgado said, "You are not my commanding officer." O'Brien almost laughed. The laugh was a terrible sound, a convulsion of the diaphragm against an open abdominal cavity, a spasm that moved his intestines against her hands that she felt as a ripple of peristalsis. That was not peristalsis, but laughter. The body unable to distinguish between the two, because both are involuntary contractions of smooth muscle. Both are the body doing something the mind did not request. And the pain hit him mid-laugh, and the laugh became a gasp, and the gasp became silence, and he lay there breathing in the shallow, rapid pattern that she recognized as the body's response to pain that exceeds its capacity to process. Teshipna, the textbook said. Suffering, the body said. "Sorry," he whispered. "Shouldn't laugh. Shouldn't laugh with my guts out." Delgado said nothing. She sutured a vessel held. She moved to the next. O'Brien watched her. Then he said in a voice that was quieter than before, quieter than his earlier voice, a voice that had traveled through pain and come out the other side into a place that was not peace, but was adjacent to peace, the way a wound is adjacent to the skin that borders it. You're the only surgeon. Yes, and you're in here with me. Yes, and out there 14 people. She did not confirm this a third time. Confirming it a third time would make it architecture, would build it into something structural, something load-bearing, something she would have to stand inside. O'Brien said, Val, I'm one guy with a shredded mesentery and no blood supply and dead tissue, and you know it, and I know it, and the only person in this tent who might not know it is the kid with the wet eyes. And here he looked at Eriksson, and Eriksson looked back, and something passed between them that Delgado could not read because it was not clinical. It was not a symptom or a sign. It was something human, something that existed outside the taxonomy of medicine. And she hated it because she could not classify it, and what she could not classify, she could not control. I'm one guy, O'Brien said again, and those are 14 people, and 5 of them are going to die, and some of them might not die if you go out there, and I'm going to die whether you're here or not. You know that, Doc? You've known that since what hour? 6 hour 5. Hour 6, Delgado said, and the admission was a hemorrhage of its own, a rupture of the containment she had built the wall, she had mortared together with silence and focus, and the Latin names of arteries, and it fell in 2 words, hour 6, and behind the wall was everything, the grief and the fury, and the 24-year-old girl in a hospital corridor, and the sentence she had sworn never to say, and the 600 patients she had not lost, and the one she was losing now, right now, she was losing him right now, and she had known since hour 6, and she had continued for 3 more hours, and the 3 hours were not medicine. They were something else, something the textbooks did not have a chapter for. Hour 6, O'Brien said. So you've been suturing dead tissue for 3 hours. She did not confirm this. Her hands continued. And in those 3 hours, O'Brien said, and his voice was gentle now, the voice he used when he talked to wounded soldiers in the field, the voice he used to keep them calm while he packed their wounds and called for medevac, the voice of a medic doing the only thing a medic can do when the bleeding cannot be stopped, which is to make the bleeding less lonely in those 3 hours. How many people came in outside? Delgado felt the question settle into her body the way a foreign body settles into tissue. The shrapnel that is too deep to remove, too close to a vital structure, the fragment that the surgeon leaves in place, because removing it would cause more damage than leaving it, and the body builds a capsule around it, a wall of scar tissue, and the fragment stays forever encapsulated, but present a permanent resident of the wound. She said, I don't know how many. You do, O'Brien said. You know? You've been counting. You always count. She had been counting. She had counted the 6 at hour 1, the 12 at hour 5, the 14 at hour 9. She had counted them the way she counted sutures and sponges and units of blood automatically, compulsively, the numbers entering her mind uninvited and arranging themselves in the part of her consciousness that tracked losses, that maintained the ledger, that ran the arithmetic of triage that she had been performing on everyone except herself and O'Brien. You're keeping me alive, O'Brien said, and I love you for it, Doc. But you're keeping me alive the way a fever keeps a body alive, by burning through everything, and the everything is out there. She felt his fingers tighten on her wrist, then release, then tighten again. The rhythm of a pulse. His pulse, or hers, or the pulse of the conversation itself, the systole and diastole of two people saying the truest things they had ever said to each other across the open cavity of a body that had become a space between them. A wound they were both inside of, a place that was neither his body nor her body, but the place where his body and her body met, which was her hands, which were inside him, which were the bridge, the suture, the vessel that connected them, and the vessel was leaking, had been leaking for hours, and she could not repair it because it was not made of tissue, but of something older, something the body knows, but the mind cannot name. "Don't make me your price," O'Brien said. "Don't make me the thing they paid. Those 14 people, those 5 Reds, don't make their dying about me. I didn't ask for that, Val. I never asked for that." Delgado's hand stopped. For the first time in 9 hours, her hands stopped moving. They were inside his body. They were holding a suture. The needle was loaded. The tissue was gray. And her hands stopped not because she told them to, but because something in the circuit, the bypass, the shunt, the collateral pathway that routed around comprehension and went directly to motion. Something in that circuit had finally received the signal it had been refusing to receive for 3 hours. The signal was, "You are hurting people by helping him." The signal was, "Your loyalty is a hemorrhage, and other people are bleeding out from it." The signal was, "He is asking you to stop." She looked at O'Brien. He looked at her. 914 days. Coffee at 4 in the morning. The brother who could swim. The silence they shared on ammunition crates watching sunrises that had no business being beautiful. The 3 tours of him running out and her cutting in, and the 2 of them together forming a single organism, a symbiont, a thing that was neither medic nor surgeon, but something the body creates when 2 separate bodies have been in proximity long enough to develop a shared immune system, a shared language of gesture and silence, a shared wound. She picked up the suture. She resumed. O'Brien closed his eyes. She heard him exhale long, slow a breath that traveled through his damaged abdomen and moved the tissue against her fingers. And she felt his surrender pass through his body into her hands, and she absorbed it the way tissue absorbs saline, taking it in, distributing it, refusing to let it reach the place where decisions are made. She sutured. The vessel held. She moved to the next. The 12th hour arrived the way organ failure arrives, not as an event, but as an accumulation, a crossing of a threshold that had been approaching for so long that the crossing itself was almost imperceptible, almost gentle. The body sliding from compensated to decompensated the way a patient slides from sleep to unconsciousness. The vital signs changing not in a single dramatic plunge, but in the slow and relentless arithmetic of decline. Each number a fraction worse than the last, each fraction too small to act on the sum of them catastrophic. Delgado could no longer feel her legs. This was not metaphor. This was not the numbness of fatigue or the tingling of poor circulation. This was the complete and absolute absence of sensation from the iliac crest to the floor, as though her body had performed its own nerve block, had decided unilaterally without her consent that the lower half of Valentina Delgado was no longer necessary for the task at hand, and could therefore be anesthetized, conserved, shut down, the way a hospital shuts down its east wing during a budget crisis. The lights off, the beds empty, the room still there, but no longer participating in the work of the institution. She operated from the waist up, Her hands moved. Her eyes tracked. Her mind, what remained of it? What the 12 hours had not eroded or edited or excised her mind, processed and decided, and her hands executed, and the lower half of her body stood, because standing was what it had been doing for 12 hours. And momentum is a force that does not require sensation, only structure, only bone and joint, and the passive tension of ligaments that hold a body upright, the way sutures hold a wound closed mechanically without opinion. She thought, I am becoming a torso. I am reducing myself to the parts that are useful. The body is triaging itself, and I am the surgeon and the patient simultaneously, and I cannot intervene because I am busy intervening on someone else. O'Brien was unconscious again. He had drifted out sometime in the 10th hour, mid-sentence, she thought, though she could not remember what the sentence was, only that his voice had been there. And then it had not been there, the way a pulse is there, and then is not there. And she had checked his carotid with her fingers, 2 fingers on the side of his neck, the gesture so automatic it did not interrupt the suture she was placing with her other hand, and the pulse was present, rapid, weak. The pulse of a heart that was doing its best with blood, that was mostly saline and oxygen, that was mostly memory, and she counted the rate, 138, and filed it and returned to the mesentery. He surfaced occasionally, not to consciousness, but to something adjacent. A twilight state, the body's compromise between awareness and mercy. And during these surfacings, he would move small movements, a hand, flexing a foot, turning the involuntary choreography of a nervous system, testing its own connections. The way a body tests a healing wound, pressing on it, checking, is this still here? Does this still hurt? Am I still inside this? And once at the end of the 11th hour, his eyes opened, and he looked at the canvas ceiling, and he said a word that was not a word, a sound, a syllable that might have been his brother's name, or might have been hers, or might have been nothing, just the air passing through vocal cords that remembered speech, the way scar tissue remembers the wound it was built to close by shape, by absence, by the negative space of the thing that was there before. Of function that indicates a system of function that indicates a system operating beyond its capacity. Her memory was dropping things. Not large things, not the procedure, not the anatomy, not the steps of the operation that her hands performed with the fluency of 17 years, but small things. The name of the suture material she was using. She looked at it. She knew it. She could not retrieve the word. It was there in the tissue of her memory, but the blood supply to that region had been redirected, triaged, sent to the parts of her brain that controlled her hands and her eyes, and the narrow beam of focus that kept her upright and operating, and the word for the suture material had been sacrificed. Proline, she said when it came back. 4-0 proline. She said it out loud because saying it out loud was a test, a diagnostic, a way of checking her own cognitive function, the way she checked O'Brien's pulse regularly, compulsively, with the understanding that the thing she was monitoring could fail at any moment, and the only defense against failure was surveillance. Eriksson was gone. She had left an hour ago. Or 2 hours ago. Delgado was not certain because the hours had lost. Their edges had become soft, had begun to bleed into each other, the way tissues bleed into each other. When the fascial planes are disrupted, when the boundaries that separate muscle from muscle and organ from organ are torn, and everything that was distinct becomes continuous, becomes a single, undifferentiated mass of damage. And time was like that, now undifferentiated, continuous, a single wound, without margins. Eriksson had said something before she left. She had said, "I'm going out there." Or she had said, "They need me out there." Or she had said nothing and simply gone because there were people dying outside and she was a nurse. And nurses go where people are dying. It is what they do. It is the tropism of their profession, the way white blood cells migrate toward infection, toward damage, toward the place where the body is breached. And Eriksson had migrated out through the tent flap and into the world that Delgado had spent 12 hours refusing to enter. Delgado did not stop her. She did not have the authority to stop her, or the energy, or the will. She had the will for one thing only, and the one thing was in front of her, on the table. And the table was the only geography that mattered. And everything outside, the table, Eriksson, the 14 casualties, the 5 Reds, the 19-year-old who was dead, the artillery that had stopped, and the silence that had replaced it, all of it existed on the other side of a membrane that she could not afford to make permeable. Then Eriksson came back. Delgado heard the tent flap. She heard boots on the plywood floor. She heard breathing Eriksson's breathing, which was different now, faster, shallower, the breathing of a body that has been running or lifting or performing CPR, which are all forms of exertion, but only one of which involves trying to force life back into a body that has decided to leave. And she heard something else. A sound that was not a sound, but an absence, the absence of the particular rhythm that Eriksson's boots had maintained for 12 hours. The steady metronomic rhythm of a competent person moving through a crisis, and the rhythm was gone, replaced by something arrhythmic, syncopated, the gait of a person whose internal pacemaker has been disrupted by something they have seen or done or failed to do. Eriksson set something on the instrument tray. Delgado did not look at it. She was suturing. She was always suturing. The mesentery was a landscape of gray and purple tissue that bled from everywhere and held nowhere, and she sutured it because suturing was the only verb her hands still conjugated, and stopping was a verb she had forgotten. Dr. Eriksson said. Delgado did not look up. Dr. Eriksson said again. And then she said, "You need to see this." Delgado looked. On the instrument tray between the hemostats and the needle drivers and the lap pads, stiff with O'Brien's blood, there was a piece of paper. It was small torn from a field notebook, the kind with the green cover and the waterproof pages that every soldier carried, and that Delgado had seen 1,000 times, and on this piece of paper, in handwriting, that was not Eriksson's, but someone else's, someone whose hand had been steady enough to write, but not steady enough to write neatly. There were 4 names. Delgado read them. She did not recognize them. 4 names. 4 people she had never met, never examined, never touched. 4 people whose bodies she had never opened, whose wounds she had never irrigated, whose blood she had never felt on her hands. They were strangers. They were names on a piece of paper, on an instrument tray, in a tent, where she had been operating for 12 hours on a man she had known for 914 days, and the names were crossed out. 4 lines, 4 names, 4 horizontal strokes of a pen that meant the same thing each time: deceased. Eriksson said, "These are the ones we lost." We. It cut cleanly the way Delgado herself cut through the membrane Delgado had built between inside and outside, between the table and the world, between the one and the many. And it cut cleanly the way Delgado herself cut without hesitation, without wasted motion, a single incision that opened the thing it was meant to open and exposed the thing it was meant to expose. We lost them. Not they died, not they didn't make it. We lost them. And the we included Delgado. The we was a suture that bound Delgado to the 4 names on the paper, whether she consented to be bound or not. Delgado looked at the names. She did not know them. She would never know them. They would remain names, abstractions, symbols, the linguistic equivalent of the anonymous vessels in O'Brien's mesentery. The tiny unnamed branches that bled and could not be repaired, and that she had spent hours suturing anyway. But each name had been a body. Each name had been a body, with a wound that she could have treated, could have opened, could have put her hands inside and done the thing she had been trained to do, the thing she was doing now, the thing she had chosen to do, here instead of there. And the choosing was the wound she had been trying not to see for 12 hours. And the 4 names were the hemorrhage from that wound. And the hemorrhage would not stop because she could not suture herself. She said nothing. She looked at the names for 4 seconds, 1 second per name, 1 second per life, 1 second per person who had died while her hands were inside Declan O'Brien. And then she looked away. She looked at her hands. They were inside O'Brien. They had been inside O'Brien for 12 hours. Her hands knew his body better than they knew her own. They knew the texture of his liver, the tension of his mesentery, the precise diameter of his jejunal lumen, the way his peritoneum felt when it was healthy, and the way it felt now, which was not healthy, which was the way tissue feels when it has been handled too many times, when it has been sutured and resutured and irrigated and debrided until it is no longer tissue, but something between tissue and scar, something that has been saved so many times it has forgotten what it was before it needed saving. She thought, my hands are in the wrong body. The thought entered her mind the way the morphine had entered O'Brien's vein, directly bypassing every defense, reaching the center immediately. My hands are in the wrong body. Not because O'Brien was wrong, because O'Brien was one. And outside, there were how many now? She did not know the current number. She only knew the dead number, 4. And the dead number was the number that mattered, because the dead number was the one that could not be revised, could not be resutured, could not be repaired with a patch of omentum and hope. She imagined the 4. She should not have imagined them. Imagining them was the clinical equivalent of removing a tourniquet. Too early it released the thing she had been containing, allowed it to flow, and once it flowed, it could not be recontained, because the damage was downstream, now spreading through the tissue of her concentration, her focus, her ability to stand at this table and operate on this body, while 4 other bodies lay outside, growing cold in the particular silence that follows the cessation of vital signs. She imagined faces she had never seen. She imagined wounds she had never examined. She imagined the last moments, the pain, the waiting, the calling for a doctor who was 20 feet away on the other side of a canvas wall, the closest doctor in the world and the most unreachable. And she imagined them understanding or not understanding that the reason no one came was because the person who would have come was choosing not to come. And the choosing was not negligence, but love. And love was not a medical term and had no place in triage. And yet here it was. Here it had been for 12 hours, sitting on her table wearing O'Brien's face, bleeding from O'Brien's mesentery. And she had been treating it as a medical problem when it was not a medical problem. It had never been a medical problem. It was the thing that medicine could not touch. She stopped imagining. She sutured. Eriksson stood beside her. The blood on her sleeve had dried to the color of old rust. Someone else's blood, the blood of the outside, and it was on Eriksson's sleeve, the way a culture result is on a lab report. Evidence data, the clinical proof that infection has spread beyond the original wound, that the pathogen has escaped containment, that the body's defenses have been breached. Dr. Eriksson said, "There are people out there who are going to die in the next 2 hours if no one operates." Delgado heard her. She heard every word. The words entered her ears and traveled to her auditory cortex and were processed and comprehended and translated into meaning. And the meaning was clear, and the meaning was true, and the meaning changed nothing because her hands were in O'Brien's body, and her hands did not respond to meaning, only to motion, only to the pattern they had been executing for 12 hours. The suture and the tie, and the cut, and the suture and the tie, and the cut, the rhythm that had replaced her heartbeat, that had become her heartbeat. That was the only vital sign she still monitored in herself. She said, "I know." 2 words. She said them, and they were insufficient, the way 6 units of blood had been insufficient, the way the morphine had been insufficient, the way every resource in this tent had been insufficient from the beginning. And the insufficiency was not accidental. It was structural. It was the design of field surgery, which is the practice of medicine in conditions that guarantee the inadequacy of medicine. And she had known this when she enlisted, and she had accepted it, and she had spent 4 tours operating inside the gap between what was needed and what was available. And the gap had always been manageable, had always been the width of a suture, the length of a tourniquet, the volume of a blood bag, and now the gap was the width of a human being, the width of Declan O'Brien, and she could not close it because she was standing inside it. Eriksson did not leave. She stood there. She stood there the way the body stands at the sight of an infection-present alert, waiting for the immune system to respond, waiting for the signal that would activate the cascade. The inflammatory response, the mobilization of resources toward the damage. She waited for Delgado to respond. Delgado did not respond. She sutured a vessel. It held. She sutured another. It held. 2 in a row. She felt a flicker of something that was not hope. She did not permit hope. Hope was a contaminant, but something adjacent to hope, the way a prodrome is adjacent to a disease, the way the first cell of an infection is adjacent to sepsis, and she thought 2 in a row. The tissue is responding, the body is fighting, and she knew this was not true, knew that 2 vessels holding was a statistical fluctuation in a field of systemic failure, knew it the way a cardiologist knows, that a single good ECG does not mean the myocardium is healthy, but she held on to it anyway, the way a body holds on to heat in hypothermia, clutching it, curling around it, burning through its last reserves to maintain the illusion that warmth is still possible. Eriksson left. She left without being dismissed. She left the way a body evacuates a limb during hemorrhagic shock, pulling the blood from the periphery toward the core, redirecting resources toward the organs that matter most. And Eriksson had decided without consulting Delgado that the core was not in this tent, but outside it, that the organs that mattered most were the 14 bodies in the triage area and not the 1 body on the table. And the decision was a diagnosis, was a judgment, was the clinical assessment of a 24-year-old nurse who had been watching a 38-year-old surgeon operate for 12 hours, and who had concluded correctly, precisely, with the diagnostic clarity that Delgado herself had taught her that the operation was no longer surgery. It was something else, something that did not have a billing code or a procedure number or a place in the surgical literature, something that lived in the space between medicine and madness, between dedication and destruction, between the oath to do no harm and the harm that was being done by doing nothing for the people who could still be saved. Delgado was alone with O'Brien. The tent was quiet. The fluorescent tube swung on its wire. It had been swinging for 12 hours, responding to vibrations she could no longer identify, and the light moved across O'Brien's abdomen in a rhythm that was almost peaceful, almost tidal, the light advancing and retreating across the tissue, the way a tide advances and retreats across a shore, and the shore was his body, and the tide was the light, and she stood in the space between them, the intertidal zone, the place that is neither land nor sea, but belongs to both. And she was neither saving him nor letting him go, but occupying the space between those acts, the narrow and diminishing space, and the space was shrinking. She checked the liver patch. It was seeping again. Third time. The omentum was softening, degrading the tissue, losing its structural integrity, the way all tissue loses integrity. When it is deprived of blood supply for too long, the cells lysing the proteins, denaturing the architecture, collapsing at the molecular level, while the gross structure still holds the building standing, while the bricks dissolve. And she reinforced it again, a fourth layer, and she knew that each layer was weaker than the last, because each layer was built on a foundation that was less stable than the one before. And the metaphor was not a metaphor. It was biology. It was the literal truth of a body that was consuming its own structures to maintain the appearance of viability. And she was helping it. She was participating in the deception. She was the body's accomplice in its own false report. She sutured. O'Brien's hand moved. The fingers that had gripped her wrist 3 hours ago flexed once weakly, the gesture of a hand reaching for something it can no longer find, and then lay still. His pressure was 74/36. His heart rate was 147. The numbers were not compatible with life. The numbers were the numbers of a body that had passed from decompensated to terminal, that had entered the final arithmetic, the subtraction that does not reverse. And she read the numbers, and she understood the numbers, and the numbers changed nothing. She sutured. Then O'Brien's eyes opened. They opened with a clarity she had not expected, not the haze of the twilight state, not the half-focus of a man moving between consciousness and unconsciousness, but a brightness, a sharpness, as though someone had adjusted the lens through which he viewed the world and brought everything into focus for the first time in hours. She recognized it. She had seen it before. The medical term was terminal lucidity, the brief and unexplained return of cognitive function that sometimes occurs in the hours before death, the brain's final performance, the body gathering its remaining glucose and its remaining oxygen and its remaining neurotransmitters and spending them in one last act of coherence, one last moment of being fully present in a body that has already begun to leave. He looked at her. "Val," he said, and his voice was different. Not the ruin of before, something closer to the voice she knew, not the same, not whole, but closer, the way a scar is closer to skin than an open wound is the approximation of the thing that was lost, recognizable but changed. "Deck," she said, and she heard her own voice. And it was the first time in 12 hours she had used his name, and the name was a wound she opened on purpose, a deliberate incision through the clinical detachment she had maintained because he was lucid, and he was looking at her, and the lucidity would not last. And she owed him to be present for it. How many, he said. She knew what he was asking. He was not asking how many casualties. He was not asking how many Reds. He was asking the question he had asked 3 hours ago, the question she had not answered, the question that had been sitting in the tissue of the conversation, the way a foreign body sits in a wound encapsulated, contained but present. How many people died because you're here with me? She did not answer. Eriksson answered from the tent entrance. She had come back. She stood in the flap with someone else's blood on her hands, fresh blood, bright red, arterial blood that caught the fluorescent light and held it, and she said, 4. And her voice was steady, and her face was steady, and only her hands betrayed her. The bright red hands, the hands that had been inside someone else's body, the way Delgado's hands were inside O'Brien's, and the blood on Eriksson's hands was the evidence, the proof, the clinical finding that confirmed the diagnosis Delgado had been refusing to make for 12 hours. 4, O'Brien repeated. 4, Eriksson said. O'Brien closed his eyes. When he opened them again, the lucidity was still there, still bright, still burning through its fuel. And he looked at Delgado, and she could see him deciding to say something, and she could see the sentence forming behind his eyes, the way she could see a hemorrhage forming behind a clot. The pressure building, the containment failing the thing that had been held back preparing to break through. He said, "Don't make me the price, Val. Don't make me the thing they paid. Those 4 people, they didn't know me. Their families don't know me. And when this is over, when they find out that there was a surgeon 20 feet away who could have saved their kid or their husband or their..." He stopped. He breathed. The breath moved through his body, and Delgado felt it through her hands, and it was shallower than the last breath, and the one before that, and the intervals were shrinking. He said, "When they find out the surgeon was in here with me because of a promise or whatever, this is what do you think they'll call it?" She knew what they would call it. They would not call it loyalty. They would not call it love. They would not call it the 914 days, or the coffee at 4 in the morning, or the brother who could swim. They would call it negligence. They would call it failure. They would call it the word that she had built her entire career to avoid, the word that lived in the corridor of a hospital where a 14-year-old girl stood while a doctor said, "We did everything we could," and the word was not enough. She was not enough. She had never been enough. The 600 patients were a fever dream, a hallucination, a story she told herself to keep the corridor from opening its door, and the door was opening now, here in this tent, in this hour, and behind it was the truth she had spent 24 years suturing closed. You cannot save everyone. You are never going to save everyone. And the decision about who you save is not medicine. It is you. It has always been you. O'Brien said, "Let me go, Doc. You've held long enough." Delgado's hands were inside his body. They had been inside his body for 12 hours. They knew his anatomy better than her own. They had memorized the texture of his liver, the rhythm of his peristalsis, the temperature of his peritoneum, and they did not want to leave. They did not want to leave, the way a body does not want to leave a fever, because the fever is terrible, but the fever is familiar, and the world outside the fever is unknown and cold and empty. And her hands did not know how to be empty, had not been empty. In 4 tours had always been holding something, a scalpel, a clamp, a retractor, a life, and if she removed them from O'Brien's body, they would hold nothing, and holding nothing was the thing she could not do. She sutured a vessel. O'Brien watched her. She did not meet his eyes. She looked at the mesentery. The tissue was purple. The sutures were holding in tissue that was no longer alive. She was sewing a shroud from the inside stitch by stitch, and she knew it, and her hands knew it, and O'Brien knew it, and Eriksson knew it, and the fluorescent light knew it, swinging back and forth above them all, indifferent, marking time the way a body marks time between the last heartbeat and the one that does not come. She sutured. The vessel held. It held in dead tissue, but it held. Captain Park entered the tent at the 16th hour, and Delgado knew why he was there before he spoke, because bodies announce their intentions before mouths do, and Park's body was announcing evacuation. The set of his shoulders, the angle of his chin, the particular arrangement of a commanding officer's musculature when he is about to deliver an order that will not be negotiated, that has been decided above him by people who will never stand in this tent, who will never smell the blood or see the light swinging on its wire or know the name of the man on the table, and the order has traveled down through the chain of command, the way a nerve impulse travels down through the body from brain to spine to peripheral nerve to muscle, each relay point, adding urgency and losing context until the order arrives at the terminal end at Park's mouth in this tent, 16 hours into an operation that was no longer an operation, stripped of everything except its essential content leave. Doc Park said. Delgado did not look up. She was reinforcing the liver patch for the 5th time. The omentum had the consistency of wet paper. Now it tore when she sutured through it, the needle pulling through the tissue, the way a needle pulls through gauze that has been soaked too long, the fibers separating the structure failing at the level of architecture, and she was placing her sutures wider, biting into deeper tissue, into the liver parenchyma itself, into the organ, rather than the patch, and she knew this was wrong. Knew that suturing directly into liver parenchyma carried the risk of bile duct injury and hemorrhage from the hepatic sinusoids and a cascade of complications that she would normally never accept. But normal had left this tent sometime around the 6th hour. And what remained was a mathematics of diminishing options, each option worse than the last, each choice a different species of failure. Doc Park said again, "Orders." She heard him. She processed the word. Orders. A word that belonged to the other language, the language of rank and structure, and the organizational architecture that kept armies functioning, and she had operated within that architecture for 4 tours, had understood, it had even respected it, in the way a surgeon respects the architecture of the body as a system that works until it doesn't, that holds until it fails, that keeps everything in its place until the forces acting on it exceed its capacity, and then it collapses. And what is inside is suddenly outside, and what was ordered is suddenly chaos. "What orders?" she said. "Withdrawal. Full withdrawal. Dust off inbound 90 minutes. Everything south of the canal is being evacuated. LZ is 2 blocks north. Everybody goes." She processed this. Withdrawal. The word had a medical meaning. The cessation of a drug, the removal of a stimulus, the body's response to the absence of something it has become dependent on. And it had a military meaning. And the two meanings were converging in this tent, in this moment, because the army was withdrawing from the city, and Delgado was being asked to withdraw from O'Brien, and both withdrawals would leave something behind that would not survive the leaving. She said O'Brien can't be moved. She said it the way she stated clinical facts flatly, with the authority of a person who has examined the evidence and reached a conclusion that does not require consensus. O'Brien could not be moved. His abdomen was open. His liver patch was failing. His mesenteric vasculature was destroyed. His blood pressure was 68/32. She had checked it 4 minutes ago or 40 minutes ago. She was no longer certain of the intervals because time had stopped behaving like time somewhere around the 12th hour and now moved in surges and pauses like the blood in O'Brien's damaged vessels, flowing and stopping and flowing again, with no rhythm she could predict. Moving him would mean closing the abdomen, which would mean accepting the closure as final, which would mean she was not coming back in, which would mean she was done, which would mean she had failed, and she was not done, and she had not failed because failure was a destination, and she had not arrived, and she would not arrive, and her hands were still moving. Park looked at the table. He looked at O'Brien, at the open abdomen, at the loops of bowel that were no longer pink but the color of twilight, at the blood-soaked drapes and the instruments scattered across the tray, and the 12 hours of effort laid open like a wound that had been treated and retreated and treated again until the treatment was indistinguishable from the injury. Park was not a doctor. Park was not trained to read the language of open bodies, but he was a soldier, and soldiers learn to read the language of damage. They learn it in buildings and in vehicles, and in the faces of the men and women they command. And what Park read on Delgado's table was a battle that had already been decided, a position that had already been lost. And the person holding the position was the last to know, or the last to admit, which is not the same thing, but produces the same result, Dr. Park said. And he used the word doctor the way a body uses a tourniquet to stop something, to cut off flow, to apply pressure to a vessel that is hemorrhaging. Doctor, not doc, which was familiar, which was the word of the field. Doctor, the word of institutions, the word that carried rank and obligation, and the particular weight of a profession that is at its core a promise to do no harm, a promise to serve, a promise to place the needs of the patient above the needs of the physician. And the word asked, whose needs are you serving? 90 minutes, Park said. If you are not at the LZ in 90 minutes, you are staying. And staying means he paused. He did not finish the sentence because the sentence finished itself in the architecture of the situation. The city was falling. The enemy was advancing, and staying meant the enemy would arrive and find a tent with a surgeon and a nurse and a body on a table. And whatever happened after that was not something Park could control, and therefore not something Park would describe, because describing it would make it real, and making it real would make it his responsibility. And he was a man who took responsibility seriously and could not take responsibility for what he could not prevent. He looked at Eriksson, then back at Delgado. He said, both of you, 90 minutes. He left. The tent flap closed behind him, and the air moved, and the fluorescent tube swung, and the light crossed O'Brien's body, and Delgado stood in the silence that Park had left behind. The silence that was shaped like an order that had edges and weight, that occupied space the way a body occupies space, displacing the air around it. 90 minutes. She calculated. 90 minutes. In 90 minutes, she could close the abdomen, a damage control closure, temporary packing, and a vacuum seal. The kind of closure that says we will come back even when no one is coming back. She could close, and she could carry him to the LZ, and she could know. She could not carry him. She could not feel her legs. She could not carry anything. And even if she could, even if her body reassembled itself into the thing it had been 16 hours ago, the thing that could walk and lift and carry O'Brien could not survive the move. The closure would take 30 minutes. The move would take 20. The helicopter would vibrate at a frequency that would disrupt every repair she had made. The omental patch would fail at altitude. The mesenteric sutures, the ones that held for seconds, would not hold for minutes. He would bleed. In the helicopter in the air with no blood and no instruments and no table, he would bleed and he would not stop bleeding, and he would die not on her table, not in her hands, but on the floor of a helicopter with a medic who was not her pressing gauze into a wound that gauze could not close. Or she could stay. She could stay in the tent with O'Brien. She could continue operating. She could maintain the fiction that what she was doing was medicine, that the sutures she was placing were therapeutic, that the reinforcements she was building were structural, that the body on her table was a patient and not a memorial. She could stay, and Park's deadline would pass, and the helicopter would leave, and the army would withdraw, and the city would fall, and she would be here, in this tent, with deck, with the light swinging, with the mesentery bleeding with her hands inside his body, and the enemy would come, or they would not come, and either way, she would be here, and he would be here. And that was the only equation her mind could solve. She looked at Eriksson. Eriksson stood by the instrument tray. The piece of paper with the 4 names was still there. She had not moved. It had left it on the tray like a specimen, like a biopsy result, like evidence of a pathology that required further examination. Eriksson's face was a clinical finding. Delgado read it. The orbicularis oculi were contracted. The masseter was tight. The sternocleidomastoid was visible, the muscle in the neck that stands out when a person is clenching their jaw, when the body is bracing for impact, for collision, for the moment of contact between 2 forces that cannot be reconciled. Go, Delgado said. Ma'am, get out to the LZ. Get on the helicopter. That's an order. Eriksson did not move. The not moving was louder than speech. The not moving said, I am 24 years old, and I have been in this tent for 16 hours, and I have watched you operate on a man who has been dying since the 6th hour, and I have carried the blood of strangers on my sleeves, and I have written 4 names on a piece of paper, and I am not leaving you here. Eriksson Delgado said, Live. She used the girl's first name for the first time. She used it because Eriksson was the name of rank, of the professional relationship, of the clean and boundaried interaction between surgeon and nurse. And that boundary had dissolved. Hours ago had been breached the way O'Brien's peritoneum had been breached, the inside leaking into the outside, the professional leaking into the personal. And what remained was 2 women in a tent, with a dying man and the truth, which was, I cannot save him, and I cannot leave him, and I need you to leave so that you survive. And I do not have to add your name to the piece of paper on the tray. Liv Delgado said, There's nothing here. The helicopter sound began at the 18th hour, a low percussive thudding. In the distance, the sound of rotors beating air into submission, and it came from the north where Park had said the LZ would be, and it meant the dust-off was here, and the dust-off was leaving, and the world was making its final offer, and the offer had an expiration, and the expiration was now. Eriksson had not left. She was sitting on an ammunition crate in the corner of the tent, with her knees drawn up and her arms around her knees and her face resting on her arms, and she was not asleep, but she was not awake in any way that Delgado recognized as wakefulness. She was in the place that bodies go when they have been pushed past endurance and through endurance and out the other side into a territory that medicine calls exhaustion, and that soldiers call gone, the body present, but the person absent, the lights on, but the house empty, the immune system still functioning, but the consciousness that directs it, temporarily offline, rerouted, redirected to whatever internal repair the body has prioritized over external awareness. Eriksson had chosen to stay. She had made this choice without announcing it, without argument, without the confrontation that Delgado had expected and half wanted, because confrontation would have given her something to push against. And pushing against things was a form of operating, and operating was the only form of being she still recognized. Eriksson had simply not left. She had stood and listened to Delgado tell her to go, and then she had walked to the ammunition crate and sat down and folded herself into the smallest shape her body could make. And she had stayed, and the staying was not obedience or defiance, but something else, something that existed outside the taxonomy of rank, the quiet and absolute decision of a person who has determined where she will be when the world ends and will not be moved. The helicopter sound grew louder. Then it held. Then it began to fade. Delgado listened to it fade the way a body listens to its own heartbeat during a cardiac event, with the acute and terrified attention of a system monitoring its own failure. The sound thinned. It became less a sound and more a vibration, a tremor in the air, the memory of a sound. And then it was gone. And the silence that replaced it was not the silence of before, not the tactical silence of repositioning, or the brief silence between detonations, but a new silence, a final silence, the silence of a place that has been abandoned by everyone who had the option to leave. The city was empty. Not literally. Cities are never literally empty. There are always the ones who cannot leave, the ones who will not leave, the ones who have nowhere to go, the ones whose bodies will not carry them, the ones who have chosen the known catastrophe over the unknown road. But the city was empty of the things that had made it a military position. The army was gone. The supply line was gone. The chain of command was gone. The helicopter was gone. And in the void they left behind, in the negative space of their departure, the enemy was arriving not with the dramatic entrance of an assault, but with the slow and methodical infiltration of an organism colonizing a host that has lost its immune defenses, moving through the streets, the way infection moves through tissue, filling the spaces that resistance had held open. Delgado stood at the table. Her hands were in O'Brien's abdomen. They had been in O'Brien's abdomen, for she calculated again, 16 hours, or 17 hours, or 18 hours, and the number no longer carried meaning. The way it had carried meaning in the first hour, or the 6th hour, or the 12th, because the number had exceeded the scale on which she measured things, and now existed in a region of time that was purely abstract, purely theoretical, the way the number of stars in a galaxy is abstract, is a number you can say but cannot hold, cannot feel, cannot convert into the embodied experience of having stood in one place and done one thing for the duration of that number. Her hands moved. She was not operating. She had stopped operating at some point that she could not identify the way a patient stops breathing, at a point that is only identified, in retrospect, when the monitor shows the flat line and the nurse checks the clock. And the time of cessation is recorded not because anyone witnessed the exact moment, but because the record requires a number, and a number is given. She had stopped operating, and what her hands were doing now was not surgery, but ritual, the movements of suturing without the purpose of suturing, the gestures of repair. Without the possibility of repair, her hands performing the choreography of their training, in the absence of any outcome that the training was designed to produce. She was maintaining him. That was the word, maintaining. The way you maintain a body on life support, not healing it, not curing it, not moving it toward any destination other than the continuation of the state. It is in the state between alive and dead that medicine has created, and that medicine sustains, and that exists only because someone has decided that it should exist, that the heart should continue beating, not because the heart wants to beat, but because stopping it requires a decision, and the decision requires a person willing to make it. She was not willing. She knew this about herself the way she knew the anatomy of the abdomen completely structurally in 3 dimensions. She was not willing to be the person who stopped. She was not willing to close the abdomen and wash her hands and say the sentence we did everything we could. The sentence that had killed her mother, that had killed the 14-year-old girl standing in the corridor, that had killed every version of Valentina Delgado that existed before that sentence was spoken. She was not willing because willing required consent, and consent required acceptance. And acceptance was the one surgical skill she had never learned, the one procedure she could not perform, the closure she could not execute. O'Brien's heart was beating at 156. His blood pressure was 58/24. His skin was the color of candle wax, not pale, not gray, but translucent, the color of a body that has redirected every drop of blood to its core and left the periphery to die, and the periphery was dying. His fingers were cold, his feet were cold, and the warmth that remained was concentrated in the center in the organs. She had spent 18 hours protected in the liver. She had patched 5 times, and the bowel she had anastomosed, and the mesentery she had sutured and resutured in 100 places, and the warmth was a lie. She knew it was a lie. The warmth was the body's last fiction, the final draft of a story. It was telling itself about survival, and the story was ending. She checked the liver patch. It was not seeping. It was bleeding. Not the slow ooze of before, but a steady flow. Dark venous, the blood coming from behind the patch, from the liver itself, from the parenchyma that her sutures had bitten into when the omentum failed, and the blood pooled in the subhepatic space and rose and overflowed into the peritoneal cavity. And she suctioned it, and it returned, and she suctioned it, and it returned. And the return was the answer to a question she had refused to ask. And the answer was, this body is done. This body has used everything it has. This body is bleeding from the places you tried to save. And the saving is now the source of the damage. And you are the infection. Valentina, your hands are the pathogen. Your persistence is the disease. She suctioned. The blood returned. She stood in the returning blood, and she heard the city outside, quiet now. The quiet of new occupation, a vehicle moving slowly on a street 2 blocks south. Voices in a language she did not speak, and she understood that the world had changed while she was in this tent, that the map had been redrawn, that the territory she stood on was no longer hers, and none of this mattered because the territory she stood on was 3 feet by 6 feet and made of aluminum and held a man whose blood she was suctioning, and the territory had never been hers. It had always been his body, his life, his dying. And she was the occupying force, the one who had invaded and held and refused to withdraw. "Dex," she said. His eyes were closed. His hand, the hand that had gripped her wrist hours ago, lay on the table beside his body. Open, the fingers curled slightly inward in the natural resting position of the hand, the position the hand assumes when the brain stops sending it instructions. And Delgado looked at that hand and saw every time it had held a compress against a wound, and every time it had gripped a litter handle, and every time it had extended toward her across an ammunition crate with a coffee cup, and the hand was still the hand. The shape was still the shape. But the thing that had animated it was retreating from the periphery to the core, the way his blood was retreating. And soon the core would not be enough. "Dex," she said again. His eyes opened, and they were clear. She had seen terminal lucidity twice before in her career, once in a soldier with a traumatic brain injury who sat up in his bed and recited his daughter's phone number and asked the nurse to call her, and then lay down and died, and once in a woman with a perforated gastric ulcer who had been unconscious for 36 hours, and who opened her eyes and told Delgado that the light in the operating room was the wrong color, and then closed her eyes and did not open them again. And she recognized it in O'Brien, the way she recognized all clinical phenomena by pattern, by the constellation of signs, the sudden clarity in the eyes, the momentary steadying of the vital signs, the body marshaling, its final reserves for one last act of presence. "Hey, Doc," he said. His voice was almost his. Not the ruin, not the sand, something that remembered the original, that carried the ghost of the warmth in the lilt, and the particular way he shaped his vowels. The Irish that was not real, Irish, but performed Irish, the accent he turned on for charm, and turned off for seriousness. And it was off now. It was serious. It was the most serious his voice had ever been. "You're still here," he said. It was not a question. It was a diagnosis. "I'm still here," she said. The helicopter left. She did not answer this because it was not a question either. It was the second finding. He was assembling the clinical picture surgeon still present, evacuation, departed city. Falling enemy arriving, and he was assembling it with the same methodical precision he had used to assess casualties in the field, the March protocol, the systematic evaluation of threats in order of lethality. And he was evaluating Delgado's situation the way he would evaluate a wounded soldier's, and the evaluation was critical. "Val," he said, "what are you doing?" She looked at her hands. They were in his body. They were holding a suction tip and a suture, and they were inside the body of a man who was dying in a tent in an abandoned city, and she was the only surgeon, and the only person, and the only thing standing between him and the thing he was moving toward, and she could not stop his moving. And her standing was futile, and she knew it was futile, and the futility did not change the standing because the standing was not about him anymore. The standing was about her, was about the corridor and the sentence, and the 14-year-old girl who had sworn an oath in the language of grief and had kept that oath for 24 years and was keeping it now, here at the end, in the blood, in the returning blood. "I'm operating," she said. He looked at her. The lucidity in his eyes was not fading, it was sharpening, concentrating the way light concentrates through a lens. And the lens was his dying, and the light was his attention, and the focal point was her face. and she felt the heat of it, the particular searing clarity of being seen by someone who has nothing left to lose by seeing you exactly as you are. "You're not operating," he said. "You stopped operating a long time ago." She did not deny this. She could not deny this. The evidence was in her hands, the sutures that held nothing, the suction that cleared blood, that returned the ritual motions of a practice that had outlived its purpose. "What I'm doing," she said, and her voice cracked, the fracture audible, structural, a fissure running through the load-bearing wall of her composure. "What I'm doing is keeping my promise." What promise, he said. And the question was not hostile. It was gentle. It was the gentleness of a medic holding a dying soldier's hand in the field, the gentleness that O'Brien had learned in 3 tours of being the last face people saw, the gentleness that is not weakness, but the final evolution of strength. "The promise that I don't lose anyone on my table," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The fluorescent light swung. The shadows moved. Outside, a vehicle engine closer now, a block away, the sound of occupation settling into the spaces Evacuation had left behind. "Val," he said, "I was never on your table. I was on your table, and I was in your tent, and I was in your war, but I was never your patient. You know that. I was the guy who brought you coffee. I was the guy who told you about Sean. I was the guy who sat with you on ammunition crates. And you kept me on this table for 18 hours, not because I'm your patient, but because I'm..." He stopped. He breathed. The breath was shallow, and the next breath was shallower, and the math was clear. "Because I'm the last person in the world you can't say that sentence to." She felt the sentence. We did everything we could. It rose in her throat. It filled the space behind her teeth. It pressed against the back of her lips. And she tasted it, metallic, like blood, and like the taste in her mouth from biting her tongue hours ago, and she swallowed it. Again. As she had swallowed it for 24 years. Pushing it down, below the diaphragm, into the dark. "Don't you dare," she said. Her voice was not her voice. It was the voice of a 14-year-old girl in a hospital corridor. It was the voice of a woman who had built an entire life on the foundation of a single refusal. "Don't you dare die on me." She whispered it. The words left her mouth and entered the space between them. The 6 inches of air above his open abdomen, the space where she had been operating for 18 hours. And the words fell into the wound and dissolved in the blood, the way her tears had dissolved hours ago, the way everything dissolved in the blood eventually, the words and the tears and the promises and the years. O'Brien looked at her. His eyes were wet. She had not seen his eyes wet in 3 tours. She had seen him carry bodies. She had seen him lose patience. She had seen him drink alone in the dark, and she had never seen his eyes wet. And they were wet now, and she understood that the wetness was not for himself, but for her, for the thing he was about to ask her to do, for the cost of the asking. "Let me go, Doc," he said. "You've held long enough." The words entered her body. They entered through her hands, through the skin of her hands that was inside his body, through the gloves that were thin as membrane, through the boundary between his tissue and her tissue that had been eroding for 18 hours, until the boundary was theoretical, was a line on a map that no longer corresponded to any feature of the terrain. The words traveled up her arms and through her chest, and they found the place where she kept the oath, the corridor, the sentence, the 14-year-old girl, and they opened that place the way she had opened O'Brien's abdomen 18 hours ago, deliberately with precision, with the understanding that opening was necessary for what came next. She looked at her hands. Her hands were inside him. Her left hand held a retractor that was retracting nothing. Her right hand held a suture that was suturing nothing. Her hands had been performing the gestures of surgery in the absence of surgery for hours, the way a heart performs the gestures of beating in the absence of blood, mechanically, faithfully, with a devotion to pattern that transcends purpose. And now O'Brien was asking her to stop. Not the patient asking the surgeon, the friend asking the friend, the person asking the person, Deck asking Val. And the asking was not surrender. It was the bravest thing she had ever witnessed, braver than running into fire, braver than 3 tours of dragging bodies through rubble, because it was asking her to do the thing she could not do, the thing her hands could not do, the thing her oath forbade, and her history forbade, and her identity forbade. He was asking her to open her hands, to let the instruments fall, to stop. She felt her fingers. They were still gripping. The thenar muscles, the interossi, the flexor digitorum profundus, all contracted, all holding, all performing the action that 17 years of training had encoded into the motor cortex so deeply that it was not voluntary, but reflexive, not choice, but architecture. The body built around the purpose, the way bone builds around a stress thickening, reinforcing becoming the shape of the thing it does. She looked at O'Brien. He was looking at her. The lucidity was dimming now. She could see it the way you see a light dimming, when the power source is failing, the filament still glowing, but the glow retreating, concentrating, becoming smaller and brighter before it becomes nothing. He was spending the last of his reserves on this, on her, on the words he had said, and the asking he had done, and the silence he was holding while she decided. She opened her right hand. The suture fell. It fell onto his mesentery, onto the tissue that was gray and purple and no longer alive, and it lay there, a thread of 4-O-proline on dead tissue, and it was the smallest thing in the world, and it was the largest thing she had ever done. She opened her left hand. The retractor slid. It slid across his peritoneum and came to rest against the abdominal wall, and it was no longer retracting, no longer holding the wound open, no longer performing the function she had assigned it, and the wound began to close not surgically, not with sutures, but organically, the tissue falling back toward its natural position, the abdomen beginning the slow and imperfect process of closing itself, the way a body closes itself, not cleanly, not completely, but with the authority of a system that knows its own architecture and is attempting, even in failure, to return to it. She picked up the needle driver, she loaded a new suture, and she began to close. She closed his abdomen the way she would. She closed his abdomen the way she would close a wound that she knew would not heal, carefully, respectfully, with the attention to detail that was not about outcome, but about dignity, about the body's right to be whole, even when wholeness was no longer possible. She approximated the fascial layer. She closed the peritoneum. She aligned the skin edges with the precision that she brought to every closure, the precision that was her signature, her identity, the thing about her hands that other surgeons recognized. She closed him the way she would want to be closed, as though the closing mattered, as though the body receiving the closure deserved her best work, as though the last act of surgery was not saving the patient, but honoring the body. She closed. O'Brien's eyes were still open. He watched her close. He watched her hands perform the final ritual of their partnership, the medic watching the surgeon, the patient watching the Dr. Deck, watching Val. And when she tied the last suture and cut the thread and laid the needle driver on the tray, he said, "Thank you." And the words were not about the surgery. The words were about the stopping. She pulled her hands out. The gloves were red. The gown was red. The drapes were red. She was red. She was covered in 18 hours of him, and the red was not the red of emergency, but the red of aftermath, the red that remains when the bleeding has stopped or when the bleeding no longer matters. And she stood in her redness and looked at her hands, and her hands were empty. And the emptiness was a wound, a new wound, the wound of having held something for 18 hours and then letting go. She walked to the basin. Her legs moved. She did not know what signals her brain was sending to muscles that had been numb for 6 hours. But they moved, carrying her the 7 steps from the table to the basin. And she turned the tap, and the water came. It still came. The plumbing still functioned in a city that was falling. The water still flowed, and she held her hands under it and watched the blood dissolve. The water turned red, then pink, then clear. She had washed her hands 12 times at the beginning, and now she washed them a 13th time. And the 13th washing was not the washing of preparation, but the washing of completion. The washing that says, "This is done." These hands have finished the thing they were doing. These hands are returning from the inside of another body to the outside where hands belong. The water ran over her fingers and between her fingers and down her wrists, and it carried O'Brien's blood into the basin and down the drain, and she watched it go, and she thought of the first washing 18 hours ago when the blood on her hands was hypothetical, was the residue of previous surgeries, was history. And now the blood on her hands was specific, was the blood of a man who was lying on a table behind her with his abdomen closed and his eyes open and his heart beating at a rate that was not compatible with life, but was still beating because hearts do not read charts. Hearts do not understand prognosis. Hearts beat until they stop, and the stopping is never gradual. It is absolute. The last beat, identical to every beat before it, except that it is followed by nothing. She turned off the water. She dried her hands. She walked back to the table. She sat on the floor. She did not choose to sit on the floor. Her legs chose. Her body chose. The accumulated weight of 18 hours chose. And the choice expressed itself as a downward motion, a surrender to gravity that she had been resisting since she first stepped to the table. And the floor was cold and hard, and it held her the way the table had held O'Brien, without comfort, without warmth, with only the impersonal support of a surface that does not care what is placed upon it. She sat with her back against the table. She could feel the table's leg against her spine. She could feel the vibration of O'Brien's body through the metal, his breathing, his heartbeat, the small involuntary movements that bodies make when they are still alive, the tremors and twitches that are the body's way of saying, "I am here. I am still here. I have not left yet." Eriksson appeared. Delgado did not know when she had risen from the ammunition crate, did not know when she had crossed the tent, but she was here now beside Delgado, and she was sitting down, lowering herself to the floor with the careful economy of a body that has been still for too long and is relearning motion, and she sat beside Delgado with her shoulder touching Delgado's shoulder, and she said nothing. The two women sat on the floor of the tent. Above them O'Brien breathed. The breaths were far apart. Each one was a separate event, a discrete act of the lungs expanding and contracting, and between each breath There was a silence that was longer than the breath, and the silence was growing, was expanding, was taking up more and more of the space that the breathing had occupied, the way scar tissue takes up the space that living tissue once occupied, not by growing, but by remaining, by being the thing that is there when the thing that was there is gone. She counted the silences. She did not mean to count. Counting was the thing she had done all her life, the reflex, the compulsion, the surgeon's habit of measuring everything. But the silences were countable, and so she counted them. 7 seconds between breaths. Then 9, then 12, then 7 again. The rhythm irregular, unpredictable. The rhythm of a system that has lost its pacemaker, that is firing on its own residual charge, that is running on the electricity stored in the cells themselves. The last reserve, the body's emergency generator. She stopped counting, carried litters and packed wounds, and held her wrist, the hand that had carried litters and packed wounds and held coffee cups, and she took it. She reached up, and she took his hand, and she held it, and his fingers were cold, and her fingers were clean, and she held his hand the way she had held his liver and his bowel and his mesentery, with both hands, with a grip that does not slip, with the attention of a surgeon holding tissue that she knows is dying, but holds anyway, because holding is the last thing hands can do when they can no longer fix. His fingers did not close around hers. They lay in her hands, open, resting the hand of a man who has stopped gripping, who has stopped reaching, who has entered the territory where the body releases its holdings one by one, the fingers first, then the hands, then the arms, the body letting go from the periphery inward, the way it had been letting go all day, the long and systematic divestment of a life. "Deck," she said. He did not answer. She listened. His breath came, shallow, a sound barely louder than the sound of the fluorescent tube swinging on its wire. Then silence. She counted. She could not stop counting. 8 seconds. 9, 10, then breath, then silence. 11 seconds. 12. She held his hand. 13 seconds. 14. The fluorescent tube swung. The light moved across the tent, across the instruments on the tray, across the drapes, across the basin, where the water had been red and was now clear, across the piece of paper with the 4 names, across Eriksson's boots, across Delgado's hands, holding O'Brien's hand in the space between the table and the floor. 15 seconds. She did not count the 16th. She did not count it because somewhere between the 15th second and the 16th, her body stopped counting. Not her mind, her body. The part of her that had been measuring and monitoring and tracking and tallying for 4 tours and 600 patients and 24 years, that part went quiet. It went quiet the way a heart goes quiet. Not gradually. Absolutely. The last count identical to every count before it, except that it was followed by nothing. She sat on the floor, holding the hand of a man who was no longer breathing. And she did not count the seconds, and she did not check the pulse, and she did not look at the clock on the far wall, and she did not call the time, and she did not say the sentence she had sworn at 14 never to say, because the sentence was for doctors, and she was not a doctor in this moment. She was Val. She was the woman who had held him for 18 hours and was holding him now, and would hold him for as long as holding was a thing that hands could do. Permeable the warmth crossing. From permeable the warmth crossing from Eriksson's body into Delgado's body, the way blood crosses from donor to recipient, the transfusion of presence, the only medicine that remained in a tent that had run out of everything else. Light came through the tear in the canvas ceiling. It was morning. She had not noticed the transition from dark to light because the fluorescent tube had been burning all night, had been swinging and casting its artificial light across the tent for 18 hours, and the artificial light had obscured the natural light, the way a fever obscures the body's baseline temperature, and now the fever was breaking. Not O'Brien's fever, not any medical fever, but the fever of the night itself, the long and terrible pyrexia of the hours between dark and dawn. And the morning light entered through the tear, and it was different from the fluorescent light. It was warm. It was gold. It fell on her hands, on the hands that held O'Brien's hand. And the hands were clean, and the hands were empty. And the hands were not holding a scalpel, or a clamp, or a suture, or a retractor. They were holding a hand, just a hand, and the hand was still, and the light was warm, and the silence was not the silence of counting, but the silence of after the silence that lives on the other side of the last number. She sat in the light. She breathed. She did not count the breaths. Don't you dare die on me. There is a question that no medical school teaches and no field manual answers, and it is this: when does holding on become its own form of harm? We build our lives around the things we refuse to let go. We call it loyalty. We call it love. We call it dedication. We build entire identities around the act of holding a scalpel, holding a promise, holding a person, and we tell ourselves that the strength is in the grip, that the measure of who we are is how long we can hold before our hands give out. We admire the ones who never let go. We build statues of them. We pin medals on their chests. We write their names on walls. But there is a moment, and it comes for everyone, though not everyone recognizes it, when the grip itself becomes the wound. When the thing you are holding has already gone, and what you are holding is the shape of its absence. When your hands are so full of what you refuse to release that they cannot reach for what still needs you. Valentina Delgado held for 19 hours. She held with hands that were trained, and hands that were tired, and hands that were cracked and bleeding inside their gloves. She held because she had promised, not in words, not in any contract or oath that could be written down and witnessed, but in the way that people promise when they hand each other coffee at 4 a.m. without being asked, in the way that people promise when they sit together in silence and watch a sunrise that has no business being beautiful in a place that has no business existing. She held because letting go meant becoming the doctor who walked out of a room when she was 14 and said a sentence that she had spent her entire life trying to unsay. And while she held, 4 people died. This is not a story about blame. Blame is the easy arithmetic, the calculation that says she should have left the table, she should have triaged correctly, she should have been a better doctor. Blame is the scalpel that cuts cleanly and leaves the person holding it feeling like the surgery is done. But the surgery is never done. The wound that Delgado carried out of that tent, the wound of knowing that her loyalty had a body count, is not a wound that blame can close. It is a wound that remains open because it should remain open, because closing it too quickly is its own kind of negligence. This is a story about the price of devotion. Not its value, its price. Because devotion has a price, and the price is never paid by the person who is devoted. It is paid by the people standing outside the tent. It is paid by the 19-year-old whose name she never learned. It is paid by the 4 names on a piece of paper on an instrument tray. It is paid by every person who has ever needed someone who was already holding on to someone else. And it is a story about the courage it takes to open your hands. We do not talk about this courage. We do not build statues of the people who let go. We do not write songs about the surgeon who put down the scalpel, the soldier who stopped firing, the mother who let her child walk into a world she could not protect them from. We do not celebrate release because release looks like defeat. It looks like giving up. It looks like the moment when the body fails and the will surrenders and the thing you were holding slips away. But Delgado did not give up. She did something harder than holding. She listened. She listened to a man who was dying and who had the clarity, the terrible, luminous clarity of a body spending its last reserves on truth to tell her that her holding was costing more than his dying. She listened and she heard and she opened her hands. She opened them not because she was weak, but because she was in that final moment strong enough to stop being strong. There are 19 hours in this story, and 18 of them belong to the surgeon. The last hour belongs to the woman. If you are holding something right now, a grudge, a grief, a promise you made to someone who can no longer hear you, a version of yourself that you built in a corridor when you were 14 and afraid, ask yourself the question that no one taught of Valentina Delgado to ask until Declan O'Brien asked it for her. Who is paying the price for what you will not release? The hands that save are the same hands that hold. And the hands that hold are the same hands that must eventually open. Not because the holding was wrong, because the opening is the last act of love. This story is dedicated to every field surgeon, every combat medic, every nurse who has stood in the space between one life and many and made a choice that no human being should have to make. And to every person who has learned at a cost they will carry forever that sometimes the bravest thing your hands can do is let go. If this story moved, you share it, not for us, but for them, for the ones who held, for the ones who were held, for the ones who stood outside the tent.